In this video, I'll show you how I made this entertainment console. If you haven't yet, click that subscribe button. Thanks. For most of my projects, I like to start with a sketch. It's the quickest way for me to present the idea to the client before spending time trying to model it in 3D. For this design, we're going to have 3 compartments. The right and the left compartments will be adjustable shelves, and the center will be drawers. The highlighted triangles will be the location for the integrated pools. The first part of the build is to construct what is the structure of the entertainment console and divide up the compartments. What I like to do when I'm working with large sheet goods is to break them down on the ground. This way it's a lot more manageable to work with on the table saw. I'm using the insulation as little spacers to keep the plywood off of the ground so that the track saw won't cut into the concrete. If you don't have a track saw, you can always use a circular saw with a straight edge guide and run your circular saw along that guide. I think it's a lot safer doing it this way instead of carrying the entire sheet and trying to break it down on the table saw. I'm breaking down these sheets into rough sizes, so I'm giving myself about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of extra material, and then I'll use my table saw to cut them down to the exact dimensions. These are the panels that will create the sides, the top, as well as divide up the compartments. Instead of using 2 solid layers of plywood for the top to give me the 1.5" profile, I'm going to create a frame for the bottom layer and then have the top glued down onto the frame. This will lighten the weight of the whole console, but still give me enough strength so that it won't flex. To get the frame to fit between the 2 finished side panels, I'll measure out the entire length of the console, and then I'll subtract the thickness of the 2 panels by using the dimensions of 2 pieces of plywood. And then I'll use the X's as an indicator for the waist side of the board. I'm going to use pocket holes to secure the frame to each other. I put a little bit of glue on the edge and then secure it with 2 screws. It helps to have a clamp to secure this connection as you're driving in the screw so that the joint does not move as you're doing that. Once the screws were installed, I'll check for square by measuring the diagonals on either side. If the dimensions match, then I'll know that the frame is squared. Once the frame was completed, I'll go ahead and cut the internal panels down to the correct dimensions. I'll have a total of 4 panels, 2 on the sides, and 2 internally to create the compartments. The 2 side panels will receive dados and rabbets to help me align the bottom and back panels later on. And once those were cut to size, I'll go ahead and mark the location for my dado and my rabbet. It's really critical to set up your dado stacks appropriately. Having a setup block or some kind of reference to make sure that you're cutting deep enough into your materials but not too deep is really critical. And when I'm using dados, I always create a test piece first. This ensures that the width of my dado is equal to the thickness of my material. You can always follow the manufacturer's chart. I'd use that as a guideline, and then I'll go ahead and make some adjustments as needed. To secure the side panels to the frame, I'll go ahead and use pocket screws. You're not going to see this joint and it'll be covered up by the finish panel, so I'm not too worried about having these screws exposed and not having to plug it. Since this panel is pretty large, I'll go ahead and use a few clamping methods. The first one is to use this parallel clamp to clamp the joint together, and then I'll use a corner clamp to make sure that my corners are going to stay perfectly 90. I'll go ahead and drive in the screws and let this thing sit overnight to dry. Once I got all the clamps removed, I'll mark the dado locations for the internal compartments, and I'll need 2 of these locations. It would have been easier if I had done this on the table saw before it was glued together, but I'll just go ahead and use my router with a patterning bit to make these cuts. Once I got the dimensions marked on the front, I'll go ahead and use a T-square to carry that marking from the front to the back of the frame. I'll mark the center of a piece of scrap plywood, and then I'll go ahead and align that mark to the mark on my frame, and that would establish the left and the right side of the dado that I need to route out. It's important to mention that I'm marking the front and the back side of the frame so that the dados are in the same location. To route out this dado, I'll go ahead and set 2 pieces of scrap plywood as a guide for the bearing on my patterning bit to ride up against. I'll make sure that my bit is only going to cut 1/4 of an inch deep into the frame. I'm going to create a jig for this later on, so you want to stay tuned for that video. It's going to allow me to create any size dado, any size groove, any size rabbet, any size half lap, so you want to stay tuned for that. Once that was done, I'll go ahead and slide the bottom panel into the 2 dados I created on the side panels, and then I'll close off the back by installing the back panel. With the dry fit looking really nice, I went ahead and took everything apart and added some glues into these dados to secure these panels into place. It's not often that I get to pull out these 10-foot pipe clamps, but having a set of them is definitely a good thing. And you know what they say, you can never have too many clamps. Now that the box is pretty much completed, I'll go ahead and slide in the internal panels, which will divide up the compartments into those dados that I routed out. This dado joint is really strong, but for safety measures, I'll go ahead and countersink in 3 screws into the side panel. You won't see these screws because it will be hidden behind the finish panel. This is the part of the build where we start to modify the interior of the compartments. In this case, I'm going to use adjustable shelves for the left and the right compartments. And this jig here will help me locate the holes for the adjustable pins. I highly recommend this jig. I'll leave a link in the description below for you to pick one up. It helps you make these adjustable pin holes super quick and super easy. The blue tape will help me prevent some of the tear out that might happen as I'm drilling out these holes. There, I'll go ahead and sand the entire box down using 80 grit, 100 grit, and then 120 grit. Now that I have the internal box completed, I'll go ahead and start on the finish panels. First thing I'll do is apply a bunch of glue on the top of the frame, and then I'll come back and spread it all out evenly. From there, I'll place the top finish panel onto the frame, clamp it together, and let it dry while I work on installing the 2 side finish panels. You'll notice that the finished panels are a little bit larger. I did it this way so that I can come back with a router to trim everything flush. Here you can see how the 2 layers of plywood gives me the 1.5 inches that I'm looking for in the design. I'm using poplar to cover the front face of that plywood edge, and then I'll use my trim router to trim it flush with the plywood box. From there I can go ahead and sand everything down nice and smooth. Now with the plywood edges that are still exposed, I'm using wood filler to fill up all the pores. This will give me a nice smooth surface in the end once I go to paint it. If you're interested in learning more about this process, I made a separate video, so click the information card above. Once the wood filler is dried, I'll go ahead and sand everything down once again, making sure I remove all of the excess wood filler. And to get to the corners, I'll go ahead and just do a little bit of hand sanding. And now it's time to paint. I'm using Sherwin-Williams products with my Fuji HVLP sprayer. I'm going to roll on 2 layers of primer, and I'll be sanding in between coats with 400 grit sandpaper, and then I'll spray on 2 to 3 coats of paint with my HVLP sprayer, and then also I'll be sanding in between coats with 400 grit sandpaper. Once the paint dries, I'll protect the paint with 2 to 3 coats of polyurethane, and I'm sanding in between coats just to knock down any dust or debris that might have settled on the surface. If you're interested in learning more about this process, definitely check the video that I made previously. I go into more details about spraying and finishing this entertainment console. Now that the paint is complete, I'll go ahead and do the drawers for the center compartment. There are many ways to build a box. The way that I'm doing it is pretty simple, mainly because it had to fit the budget and the time for this build. First thing that I need to do is rip all of my plywood down to the appropriate height that I want for the drawers, and then I'll go ahead and cross-cut them to the appropriate lengths. I'm building a total of 4 drawers, with one of those drawers being a small, hidden, sort of like a remote drawer, and it will be accessible through the top drawer. Installing drawer slides could be complicated. It definitely helps to have some kind of jig, just like this jig that I'm using here, to properly locate where my slides will be on the left and the right side. Another important factor is whether or not the box that you build is precise. You're only given maybe half an inch of clearance between the side of your drawer and the side of your box. So you got to make sure that you're accounting for all of these tolerances when you're building your drawer as well as building your box. If you don't have the jig that I was using, you can always use a piece of scrap wood. You just got to make sure that you use the same piece on the left and the right side. That way you know that the drawer slides are installed at the right location on either sides. And with the test fit, everything's working properly. Now it's on to the exciting part, working with walnut and also creating these integrated drawer pulls. The first thing I have to do is take all of my rough lumber and cut them down to size and then mill them at the jointer and planer. I'll go ahead and use the miter saw to cut them down to relatively within 2 inches of the final dimensions. It probably took me maybe 3 hours to get these boards milled up, but I really love working with walnut and I really love this milling process. You really get to see what's behind that rough surface. And that's part of the surprise with working with rough lumber. At first I didn't really like what I was getting from the wood grain, but in the end I really loved how it looked. So it's part of that process, and that's the process that I love. And this is what I yielded from all of that rough lumber. The next part is to lay out the grain in a pattern that sort of makes sense. As I mentioned before, I didn't like what I was seeing from milling up these boards. The tone was a little bit inconsistent. Some of the boards were pinker, some of the boards were more brown. Some of them had really weird knots and grain pattern that was really wide. So it took me a little while to determine how I wanted to arrange the boards. In the end, I really loved how the grain looks once it was finished. So definitely it was worth the time and effort to arrange the board a certain way, just so you can get an idea of how it should look like in the end. But ultimately, you won't really know until you apply finish to it. And in the end, I kind of got lucky. So now that the panels have been sanded down with a drum sander to an even thickness of 3/4 of an inch, I went ahead and cut the panels down to the correct size with the crosscut sled. I like to install my hardware before applying finish to my doors. That way, if I ever need to make any modifications, I can go ahead and do that without having to worry about refinishing. I really love this jig that Craig has. It's super convenient when installing these hinges. It definitely takes a lot of the guesswork out so that you can get these hinges installed accurately. But on the cabinet side, you still need to make some measurements based off of your hinge specifications. So you follow those dimensions, your doors will work perfectly fine. These are Bloom hinges that I'm using. They're a little bit on the pricey end, but they work really well. They offer three-way cam adjustability, so you can adjust the door to make sure that it lines up with your frame and that the gaps between the door and the frame is perfectly even. So once I got the doors test fit and they were working properly, I went ahead and installed the walnut fronts for the drawers. This one here is the front for the hidden drawer that will be behind the main front panel. It's operating on a push to open drawer slide. I don't need any hardware for me to open up that drawer. I just have to push that drawer and it'll pop open. To install the drawer fronts for the lower drawers, I usually use a deck of cards, but I don't know where my deck of card is at the moment. So I just pulled out some scrap pieces of paper and used them as spacers for the gap between the door and the drawer front. This way I know that the gaps will be perfectly even on both sides. Then I'll go ahead and drive in the screws from the back, making sure to countersink each one. I made some adjustments to the drawers and the drawer front in between, but this is what the results are and it's looking great. I'm going to create these recesses in the front of the doors to line up with the gaps on the drawers. I think this detail really ties it all together. I like that the panels look like they're continuous, and it also breaks apart the vertical grain in the walnut, which I feel like it's a nice contrast to the horizontal lines. To create the integrated pulls, I'm using a 14-degree dovetail bit to route out the entire area. Since this bit has a bearing, I'll use a piece of wood as a guide so I can make sure that I'm cutting nice and straight. This is the problem if you don't have a router table. Sometimes you're going to get some unevenness, but a little bit of hand sanding will solve it. And now I can see that they line up perfectly. Yes, that's yellow, very yellow. And yes, I'm gonna paint walnut. And you can't stop me. Before I paint the entire area, I like to tape out the edges, so that would help me with the cleanup later on. There's going to be a little bit of paint that seeps through the tape, but it's easily cleaned off by using a blade. In order to keep the paint from peeling off, I use a blade to cut the edge of the paint. That way, whenever I go to peel the tape, I'm given a nice clean edge, minus the paint that seeps through the edge. Usually, most surfaces in your house, your furniture, your cabinets, they're going to have some kind of edge treatment. It's usually rounded over or chamfered. I like to just simply round over my edges by applying a little bit of hand sanding. It's going to break the edges just a little bit, but it'll still give me that clean, sharp, straight edge that I prefer. Once I got everything sanded down to 120 grit, I'll go ahead and spray the polyurethane finish on top. I'm doing 2 coats of polyurethane finish, and then I'll sand between coats with 400 grit sandpaper just to knock down any dust or debris that might have settled onto the surface. Finally, I can go ahead and assemble everything and call this project done. Sometimes projects have very limited budgets, and this was one of them. But I feel like as a designer, these constraints really push me to think creatively in how I approach the build to not only meet the budget constraints, but also, in the end, provide something beautiful. This has been Bao, a Design Craft Workshop. See ya. If you like this video, hit that like button and definitely subscribe. Thanks.